In the first week of May 1945, the war in Europe gasped its last. Amidst the sulphurous ruin of the Third Reich, the iron gates of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria were finally thrown open by American soldiers. What they found inside was a landscape sculpted by hell itself. Mountains of emaciated corpses were bulldozed into mass graves, and from the barracks stumbled creatures that were once human, skeletal figures with hollow eyes that held the vacant stare of the damned. Among them was a man, prisoner 5344. He was an architect by training, a ghost by circumstance. He weighed less than 100 pounds, his body a roadmap of starvation and torture, but within his ravaged frame, a cold, diamond-hard resolve was beginning to form. His name was Simon Wiesenthal. As the world celebrated a victory that felt total and absolute, this man, this survivor, understood a terrifying truth. For him, and for the 6 million souls who had been turned to ash and smoke, the war was not over. It had simply entered a new, quieter, and far more insidious phase. The battle was no longer against armies and states, but against memory, against indifference, and against the shadows where the architects of this genocide were already beginning to disappear. This is not the story you believe you know. It is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil, of righteous victors bringing the guilty to a swift and certain justice. That is the comforting myth, the narrative tidied up for textbooks and victory parades. The horrifying reality is that in the chaotic aftermath of the world's greatest cataclysm, justice was not a foregone conclusion. It was a desperate, often failing enterprise. How did thousands of the most monstrous figures in human history, camp commandants, doctors who tortured in the name of science, bureaucrats who scheduled death on timetables, simply vanish? How did men responsible for industrial-scale murder find tranquil retirement in sun-drenched suburbs, protected by systems of power, politics, and even faith? This narrative will peel back the veneer of post-war order to reveal the festering truth beneath. A story of calculated escape, cynical alliances, and moral compromises that stain the records of nations and institutions to this day. We will follow the clandestine pathways known as the Ratlins. We will question the complicity of those who offered sanctuary to mass murderers, and we will track the fugitives who slept soundly, believing their crimes were forgotten. We will do all of this by following the footsteps of the one man who refused to let them rest, the architect-turned-avenger who became the living conscience of the Holocaust. The world was promised a reckoning. The trials at Nuremberg were meant to be the capstone of Allied victory, a moment where civilization itself would put Nazism on trial and declare its ideology and its practitioners anathema to humanity. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if that promise would be kept. But what followed was not a comprehensive cleansing, but a deeply flawed and selective process. The great machine of justice, so grandly unveiled, soon began to slow, its gears clogged by political expediency, the looming chill of a new Cold War, and a global weariness that craved forgetting over accountability. The true story of the post-war era is one of a profound and systemic failure, a failure that allowed evil not just to survive, but to thrive in hiding. It is the story of a hunt conducted not by the mighty apparatuses of state power, but often by a handful of underfunded, ignored, and obsessed private citizens. At the center of it all was Simon Wiesenthal, a man who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose in his quest. His mission was not one of vengeance, a notion he always dismissed as insufficient. What he sought was something far more difficult and far more profound: justice. He was not hunting men. He was hunting the truth, armed with little more than lists of names, survivor testimonies, and a memory that would not grant him peace. Before the world broke, Simon Wiesenthal's life was one of structure, ambition, and quiet comfort. Born in 1908 in Buxax, a town then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was a product of an assimilated Jewish middle class that believed in education, progress, and its place in a modernizing Europe. He was an architect, a man who built things, who understood the logic of blueprints and the stability of foundations. He studied in Prague and Lwów, married the love of his life, Sila Muller, and opened his own architectural office in Lwów, then part of Poland. His world was one of drafts and designs, of contracts and the pleasant, predictable rhythms of professional life. He was a European, a Pole, a husband, an architect. His Jewishness was a part of his identity, but not, he thought, the defining feature upon which his entire existence would one day pivot. The rise of Nazism in Germany was a worrying rumble in the distance, but for many like him, the idea that the entire edifice of European civilization could collapse into a charnel house was simply unthinkable. It defied the logic he had built his life upon. That logic was systematically dismantled starting in 1939 with the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland, and then shattered completely in 1941 when the Germans arrived. The Nazi occupation of Lwów transformed the city into a gateway to hell. Wiesenthal and his family were swept up in the brutal machinery of the Holocaust. His world of blueprints was replaced by a world of ghettos, forced labor, and the constant, arbitrary threat of execution. He was separated from his wife, each believing the other to be dead, a common fate that multiplied the agony of the camps. Wiesenthal's journey through the next 4 years is a testament to sheer, unyielding endurance. He survived 12 different concentration and labor camps, a geography of horror that included the notorious Janoska camp, where prisoners were forced to play music during mass shootings, and the Plazow camp, commanded by the sadist Mongoth. Finally, he arrived at Mauthausen in Austria, a Grade 3 camp, meaning it was designed for the incorrigible political enemies of the Reich, a place from which return was not intended. He saw men worked to death in its granite quarry, the infamous stairs of death, and witnessed acts of cruelty so profound they seemed to defy human imagination. When the American tanks finally rolled in, he was a wraith, a man stripped of his family, his profession, his health, and his entire world. But deep within that broken body, the architect's mind was still working, not designing buildings, but beginning to construct a new, terrible blueprint, a map of where the guilty were hiding. The Europe into which Wiesenthal and millions of other survivors emerged was a continent on its knees. It was a vast, open wound of rubble, displacement, and starvation. Entire cities had been bombed into lunar landscapes. National governments had ceased to exist, replaced by Allied military occupation. The infrastructure of civilization, roads, railways, communication, law enforcement, was in tatters. Tens of millions of people were on the move. Demobilized soldiers, freed prisoners of war, liberated slave laborers, and Jewish survivors with no homes to return to. They were all displaced persons, a sterile bureaucratic term for a sea of human misery. This overwhelming chaos, this breakdown of all order, was the perfect environment for a man on the run. For a former SS officer or a Gestapo torturer, shedding a uniform, acquiring a crude forgery of a new identity, and melting into the desperate, anonymous crowds was dangerously easy. The sheer scale of the administrative task facing the Allies was impossible. They were trying to feed millions, prevent epidemics, and restore basic services, all while attempting to govern a defeated and resentful German population. Into this chaotic landscape, the Allies brought an initial, seemingly iron-willed determination to enact justice. The policy of denazification was meant to be a deep, systemic purge of German and Austrian society. Nazi laws were abolished, the party was outlawed, and its symbols were banned. More than that, millions of Germans were required to fill out a Fragebogen, a detailed questionnaire about their activities during the Reich, in a massive effort to identify perpetrators and collaborators. The centerpiece of this effort was the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. In the autumn of 1945, the world watched as the highest-ranking surviving Nazis, men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, were placed in the dock. This was to be more than a trial. It was to be a lesson in history and morality, establishing for all time the concept of crimes against humanity for survivors like Wiesenthal. The news from Nuremberg offered a fragile glimmer of hope. It was a public acknowledgement of their suffering and a promise that the orchestrators of that suffering would be held to account. The prosecution meticulously laid out the monstrous scale of the Nazi project, using the Nazis' own obsessive documentation against them. It seemed, for a moment, that the moral order of the universe was being restored. But behind the grand theater of the Palace of Justice, a colder political reality was already taking shape. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was beginning to crack, and the shadow of the Soviet Union was falling across Eastern Europe. This new existential threat would soon change everything, turning former enemies into potential assets and making the arduous, expensive, and politically inconvenient task of hunting down every last Nazi seem like a luxury the world could no longer afford. For Simon Wiesenthal, liberated but not yet free, the turning point was not a single event but a slow, dawning horror. Immediately after his liberation, he began working for the War Crimes Section of the United States Army. His fluency in several languages and his architect's eye for detail made him a natural investigator. He began to compile lists of names, to interview fellow survivors, to cross-reference testimonies, and to build case files against the SS men, the guards, and the capos who had tormented him and murdered so many others. He was instrumental in providing evidence that helped convict several perpetrators in the early American-led trials at Dachau. But as 1946 turned into 1947, he noticed a chilling shift. The political winds were changing. The focus of the American and British authorities was moving away from the past and toward the future. The enemy was no longer the brown-shirt Nazi, but the red flag of communism. The Marshall Plan was being devised to rebuild Germany, not to punish it. The grand project of denazification was being quietly dismantled. It was deemed too complex, too slow, and too alienating to a German populace that was now needed as a partner in the new Cold War. This dawning realization was Wiesenthal's true catalyst. He saw American officers, once zealous in their pursuit of war criminals, being reassigned. He saw files marked closed for lack of immediate leads. He saw the vast investigative apparatus being packed up. The world, it seemed, was growing tired of justice. It was this institutional forgetting, this political expediency, that galvanized him into action. If the victorious governments would not continue the hunt, then he would. In 1947, with a handful of fellow survivors and volunteers, he established the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Linz, Austria. It was a grand name for a humble, underfunded operation run out of few cramped rooms. They worked with ferocious intensity, poring over captured Nazi documents, chasing down rumors, and meticulously building a private archive of evil. It was here that he began to understand the true scale of the problem. The men they were hunting were not simply hiding in attics or remote farmhouses. They were organized. They were being helped. Whispers began to surface of a well-trodden escape route, a path that led south through the mountains to Italy. It was often called the Klosterroute, the monastery route. Wiesenthal and his small team began to see a pattern. Fugitives would disappear from Allied internment camps in Germany and Austria, only to resurface months or years later with new names and new passports, often issued by the International Red Cross, far away in South America. The hunt was no longer just about finding individuals. It was about uncovering a conspiracy. The consequences of this new mission were immediate and profound. Wiesenthal had made a life-altering choice. His pre-war profession was a ghost, a relic of a life that no longer existed. His new calling was all-consuming. While other survivors tried, understandably, to rebuild their lives, to find some semblance of normalcy, he chose to live permanently in the shadow of the past. He and his team faced overwhelming odds. They had no official power, no authority to make arrests, and precious few resources. They were often met with indifference and sometimes outright hostility from local Austrian and German authorities, many of whom were former Nazi Party members who had been quietly reintegrated into the civil service. Wiesenthal was a man sustained by little more than coffee, cigarettes, and a burning sense of obligation to the dead. He felt he was their representative on earth, their last advocate. The work was painstaking and heartbreaking. Every new testimony was a journey back into the abyss. Every dead end was a victory for the perpetrators. And with each passing month, the trails grew colder, and the fugitives slipped further away, protected by a network of sympathizers that reached into the most unexpected and powerful of institutions. The fight for justice had become a race against time and a battle against apathy, and Simon Wiesenthal was almost entirely alone. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the problem that had been a trickle of escaping Nazis became a flood. The escape network, which Wiesenthal and others had only glimpsed in fragments, was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation. It was not a single, centralized organization like the fictional Odessa of popular thrillers, but rather a series of overlapping and interconnected ratlins that shuttled thousands of wanted men to safety. The primary route ran south from Germany and Austria, over the Alps to Italy. The key nodes in this network were in Genoa and, most importantly, Rome. And at the heart of the Roman hub was a man of the cloth, Bishop Alois Hudel, the rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, a German-speaking seminary within the Vatican shadow. Hudel was no mere humanitarian acting out of misguided Christian charity. He was an ardent pan-German nationalist and Nazi sympathizer who saw the defeat of Germany as a catastrophe for Europe. He believed the men he was helping were not criminals, but anti-communist soldiers who would be needed in the coming struggle against the Soviet Union. From his office, Hudel provided fugitives with shelter, money, and, most crucially, new identities. He used his connections to procure false identification papers and then leveraged those documents to obtain legitimate passports from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was overwhelmed with processing millions of refugees and often lacked the resources to vet applicants thoroughly. The list of men who benefited from this clerical assistance is a who's who of Nazi mass murder. Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps, where nearly 1 million Jews were gassed, escaped an Austrian prison and made his way to Rome. Hudel provided him with a Red Cross passport and passage to Syria, from where he later moved to Brazil. Gustav Wagner, the sadistic deputy commandant of Sobibor, known as the Beast, followed a similar path. Walter Roth, the inventor of the mobile gas vans that murdered nearly 100,000 people, also found sanctuary and escape through these channels. The central clearinghouse for many of these fugitives was the Franciscan monastery at Via Sicilia in Rome. Here, men whose hands were stained with the blood of thousands found comfort, clothing, and guidance on the next steps of their journey. While the extent of official Vatican knowledge or sanction of these activities remains a subject of intense historical debate, the actions of individuals like Hudel and his network of sympathetic priests and monks are undeniable. They were the architects of a sacred pipeline, a holy escape route that laundered the identities of monsters and delivered them to freedom. The final destination for many on the Ratlins was South America, and particularly Argentina. Under the rule of President Juan Perón, Argentina became a veritable paradise for fleeing Nazis. Perón and his influential wife, Eva, held a deep admiration for the fascist regimes of Europe. More pragmatically, they saw these fugitives not as criminals, but as a source of valuable military and technical expertise that could help Argentina become a major world power. The Peronist government actively sent agents to Europe to recruit and facilitate the immigration of wanted men. They offered a warm welcome, protection from extradition, and the opportunity to build new lives without fear of reprisal. It was here, in the sprawling suburbs of Buenos Aires, that two of the Third Reich's most infamous figures found anonymity. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, who performed grotesque and fatal experiments on twins and dwarfs, arrived in 1949. He lived openly, for a time even using his own name, and ran several businesses. And it was here that the ultimate bureaucrat of death, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind of the final solution, settled with his family under the alias Ricardo Clement. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory, living a quiet, unassuming life, a portrait of the terrifying banality of evil. While these men enjoyed their freedom, Simon Wiesenthal's lonely crusade was faltering. By 1954, the world's indifference had become unbearable. The Cold War was at its peak. West Germany had been rearmed and integrated into NATO. The focus was entirely on the Soviet threat. The hunt for Nazis was seen as a distraction, an old grievance that stood in the way of present-day alliances. Funds for Wiesenthal's documentation center in Linz had dried up completely. Governments were no longer interested in the information he provided. Defeated and exhausted, he made the painful decision to close the center. He packed up his thousands of files, the names, the testimonies, the photographs of the dead and their killers, and sent them to the Yad Vashem archives in Israel. He kept only one file for himself, the file on Adolf Eichmann. He returned, or tried to return, to a normal life, working for Jewish relief organizations. But the ghost would not let him rest. The knowledge of where these men were, the injustice of their freedom, gnawed at him. He was a man living in a world that desperately wanted to forget, while he was constitutionally incapable of doing so. The psychological toll was immense. He was a Cassandra, crying out a warning that no one wanted to hear. His obsession was seen by some as a pathology, a refusal to move on. But for Wiesenthal, moving on was a betrayal. Forgetting was the final victory for the Nazis. His memory was his weapon, and his duty was to the 6 million who had no one else to speak for them. He was simply waiting, holding on to that one last file, believing that one day the world would be forced to listen again. That day came in 1957, born not of a grand government initiative, but of a simple human connection. A German prosecutor in the state of Hesse, a man named Fritz Bauer, received a letter. It was from a German-Argentine man named Lothar Hermann, who had fled Germany because of his Jewish father. Hermann lived in Buenos Aires, and his daughter, Sylvia, had recently started dating a young man named Klaus. The young man, full of boastful pride, often spoke of his father's past as an important SS officer and lamented that Germany had lost the war. One day, he brought Sylvia home to meet his family. The father's name was Ricardo Clement, but Klaus and his brothers occasionally referred to him by another name, Eichmann. Lothar Hermann, reading a German newspaper article that mentioned Eichmann as a fugitive, put the pieces together. He wrote to Fritz Bauer, a prosecutor known for his anti-Nazi convictions. Bauer, knowing that the German intelligence services were riddled with former Nazis who would likely tip Eichmann off, did not trust his own government. Instead, he secretly flew to Israel and delivered the information directly to Isser Harel, the head of the Mossad. Simultaneously and independently, Simon Wiesenthal was back on the case. He had received a tip from a contact in Argentina, an old baron who had been a stamp-collecting acquaintance during the war. The baron sent him a postcard from Buenos Aires with a cryptic message. "I saw that dirty pig Eichmann. He lives near Buenos Aires and works for a water company." While the details were slightly off, it was another piece of the puzzle. Wiesenthal passed this information to the Israeli consulate in Vienna. For 2 years, the Mossad worked to verify the intelligence. They sent agents to Argentina, conducted painstaking surveillance on the house on Garibaldi Street where the Clement family lived. The final confirmation was chillingly domestic. On March 21, 1960, the day of his and his wife Vera's silver wedding anniversary, Ricardo Clement came home with a bouquet of flowers. Mossad agents, cross-referencing the date with the known wedding anniversary of Adolf and Veronica Eichmann, knew they had their man. The operation, codenamed Finale, was greenlit. For Wiesenthal, hearing the news that Israel was finally acting, it was the culmination of 15 years of relentless, thankless work. The world was about to be shaken from its slumber. The ghost he had hunted for so long was about to be made flesh. On the evening of May 11th, 1960, on a quiet, unlit street in a working-class suburb of Buenos Aires, Adolf Eichmann stepped off a bus after his shift at the Mercedes-Benz plant. As he walked toward his home, a car that had been parked by the roadside suddenly blinked its lights. Several men emerged from the shadows. Eichmann, sensing danger, tried to run, but it was too late. One of the men, the legendary Mossad agent Peter Malkin, grabbed him in a gloved hand, whispering in German. One moment, they wrestled him into the car and threw a blanket over his head. For 9 days, he was held in a Mossad safe house, interrogated and forced to confirm his identity, which he eventually did, even providing his SS serial number. The problem now was getting him out of Argentina. He was drugged, dressed in the uniform of an El Al flight attendant, and smuggled onto a specially arranged Israeli diplomatic flight. Propped up between two agents as if he were a drunk or sick colleague, the architect of the Holocaust was flown out of the country that had given him refuge. When Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced to the Knesset and the world on May 23rd that Adolf Eichmann is in Israel and will shortly be put on trial, a shockwave went around the globe. It was a moment of stunning, audacious justice, an act that defied international law to serve a higher moral law. The capture of Eichmann was not just a victory for the Mossad or for Israel. It was a profound vindication for Simon Wiesenthal and every survivor who had refused to forget. The world was now listening. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, which began in Jerusalem in April 1961, was a seminal event of the 20th century. It was not merely the trial of one man. It was a public education in the mechanics of genocide, broadcast to a global audience. For the first time, hundreds of Holocaust survivors took the stand, their voices trembling, their faces etched with trauma as they told their stories. They spoke of Auschwitz and Treblinka, of ghettos and gas chambers, of lost children and murdered families. Their testimony transformed the Holocaust from an abstract historical event into a raw, immediate human tragedy. And there, in a specially constructed bulletproof glass booth, sat Eichmann. He was not the monstrous, frothing villain many expected, but a pale, thin-lipped, unremarkable-looking man in a cheap suit. His defense was that he was merely a cog in the machine, a bureaucrat following orders, a transportation official who was guilty only of aiding and abetting. It was this very banality of evil, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt famously termed it, that was so chilling. He was the paper pusher, the functionary who organized the train schedules that sent millions to their deaths without, he claimed, any personal animosity. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, he was hanged on June 1st, 1962, his body cremated, and his ashes scattered over the Mediterranean Sea outside Israeli territorial waters, to ensure there would be no grave for his followers to venerate. The Eichmann trial was a powerful catalyst. It reawakened the world's conscience and shattered the comfortable silence that had protected so many other Nazi fugitives. For Simon Wiesenthal, it was a turning point. He was no longer a lonely, obscure obsessive, but an internationally recognized figure. He was able to reopen his Jewish documentation center, this time in Vienna, with proper funding and a new sense of purpose. Governments that had previously ignored him were now more willing to cooperate. The hunt was back on, and Wiesenthal pursued it with renewed vigor for the rest of his life. His work led directly to the capture and prosecution of dozens of other major war criminals. In 1967, Franz Stangl, the former commandant of Treblinka living under his own name in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was arrested after Wiesenthal tracked him down. He was extradited to West Germany, tried, and sentenced to life in prison, where he died of a heart attack. Another of Wiesenthal's most famous cases was that of Hermine Braunsteiner, the sadistic female guard from the Majdanek camp, known as the Stomping Mare for her habit of kicking inmates to death with her steel-studded boots. In 1964, Wiesenthal discovered she was living as a respectable housewife, Mrs. Russell, in the borough of Queens in New York City. The revelation caused a media storm and a long legal battle, which ultimately resulted in her denaturalization and extradition to West Germany in 1973, where she too was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet, for every success, there are haunting failures. The most prominent of these was Joseph Mengele. The Angel of Death proved to be the most elusive of all the major Nazis. Using his family's wealth and a network of German expatriates, he moved between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, always managing to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. Despite a massive international manhunt in the 1980s, he was never caught. It was only in 1985 that his body was exhumed from a grave in a Brazilian cemetery, where it was determined that he had died from a stroke while swimming in 1979, having evaded human justice to the very end. Another notorious figure, Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, the Gestapo chief who tortured French resistance fighters, including Jean Moulin, to death, also enjoyed decades of freedom. His escape was even more galling because it was facilitated by American intelligence. After the war, the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps recruited Barbie as an agent for his anti-communist knowledge and connections, protecting him from French prosecution and eventually helping him escape to Bolivia via a Ratlin. He lived there for over 30 years as a wealthy businessman named Klaus Altmann, until he was finally identified and, after a long diplomatic struggle, extradited to France in 1983. His trial, like Eichmann's, was a national reckoning, forcing France to confront the darker aspects of its own collaborationist past. The story of Klaus Barbie's recruitment by American intelligence was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a far larger and more morally compromised program, one that represented the ultimate triumph of pragmatism over justice. While Simon Wiesenthal was painstakingly hunting down Nazi murderers, the government of the United States was actively and secretly recruiting them. The program was called Operation Paperclip. In the frantic final days of the war, American military intelligence realized that Germany's scientific and technological prowess, particularly in rocketry and aerospace engineering, was far ahead of its own. To let this expertise fall into the hands of the Soviet Union was deemed an unacceptable risk to national security. Thus began a covert operation to identify and exfiltrate top German scientists, engineers, and technicians, and bring them to America to work on its military and space programs. The moral problem was that many of these brilliant minds were also committed Nazis, and some were deeply implicated in war crimes. The most famous paperclip scientist was Wernher von Braun. The aristocratic and charismatic rocket scientist was the driving force behind the V-2 rocket program. These were the terror weapons that had rained down on London and Antwerp, killing thousands of civilians. More damningly, the V-2 rockets were built using slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where an estimated 20,000 prisoners died from starvation, disease, and brutal working conditions. Von Braun, an SS officer himself, personally visited the underground factories and was well aware of the horrific conditions. Yet, to the American military, his genius was indispensable. His file, and the files of hundreds of others with similarly dark pasts, was sanitized. Their Nazi affiliations were scrubbed, their records bleached to create new, acceptable identities that would pass security clearance. Men like Kurt Blome, a high-ranking Nazi scientist who had overseen horrific bacteriological experiments on concentration camp prisoners, were acquitted at Nuremberg and then immediately hired to work on American chemical warfare projects. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German specialists to the United States. They became the backbone of NASA's rocket program, culminating in von Braun's ultimate triumph as the architect of the Saturn V rocket that took American astronauts to the moon. It was a staggering achievement, but it was built upon a foundation of profound moral compromise. While one arm of the American government had prosecuted Nazis at Nuremberg, another had secretly embraced them, prioritizing the technological race against communism over the demands of justice for their victims. It was the ultimate cover-up, a state-sanctioned absolution for the sake of power. The long-term consequences of this complex post-war period are still with us. The Eichmann trial established a powerful precedent for holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of where they were committed. It laid the conceptual groundwork for the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and ultimately for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. The work of Simon Wiesenthal and others, like the French couple Serge and Beat Klarsfeld, who hunted down Klaus Barbie, helped to establish the legal principle that there should be no statute of limitations for genocide. They forced nations to confront their own pasts, leading to the creation of special investigative units in the United States, Canada, and Australia to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals who had found refuge within their borders. The hunt transformed public consciousness, ensuring that the Holocaust would not be forgotten and that its lessons about the dangers of hatred, indifference, and state-sanctioned evil would be passed to new generations. Yet, history is rarely a simple story of progress. The legacy of this period is also one of profound and unsettling ambiguity. The controversies surrounding Simon Wiesenthal himself highlight the complexities of memory and justice. Critics have pointed to inaccuracies in his accounts and have sometimes accused him of exaggerating his role in certain captures to maintain public interest and funding for his work. While his defenders argue these were minor embellishments in the service of a greater good, they underscore the immense pressure and difficult choices faced by those who take on such a monumental task. The debate over the role of the Vatican also continues to rage. Was the aid provided by Bishop Hudel and others an official, if secret, policy sanctioned by Pope Pius XII out of a fear of communism? Or was it the rogue actions of sympathetic clerics that the institutional church simply failed to stop? The sealed archives and the passage of time leave these questions hanging, a source of continued pain and contention. History, as these debates show, is not a settled verdict but a contested field of interpretation. If there is a single, overarching moral to be drawn from this dark chapter, it is a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice and the corrosive nature of political realism. The story of the Nazi hunters versus the state-sponsored recruiters reveals a fundamental conflict that echoes through our own time: the clash between moral imperatives and perceived national interest. When faced with a new enemy, the crimes of the old one were quickly forgiven, if not forgotten, by the great powers. It reveals the terrifying ease with which institutions can subordinate ethics to expediency. The life of Simon Wiesenthal stands as a powerful counter-narrative to this cynicism. His entire existence after the war was a testament to the power of individual conscience and memory standing against the tide of collective amnesia. He understood that true peace could not be built on a foundation of unpunished crimes. For him, justice was not about retribution. It was about order, about restoring a moral balance to a universe that had been thrown into chaos. It was about proving that even decades later, across continents and oceans, the choices a person makes will have consequences. The contrast between the public image and the private reality of this era is staggering. The world saw the heroic images of the moon landing, a symbol of American ingenuity and peaceful exploration. It did not see the hidden history of the men who designed the rockets, men whose pasts were stained by their service to a genocidal regime. The world saw the economic miracles of post-war Germany and Austria, a testament to a desire to rebuild and move on. It did not see the quiet suburban lives of thousands of unpunished murderers living comfortably amongst their neighbors. It is this chasm between perception and truth that Simon Wiesenthal dedicated his life to bridging. He fought to ensure that the official, sanitized version of history would not be the only one remembered. He knew that myths are built on silence, and he refused to be silent. We end where we began, at the gates of Mauthausen in May of 1945. The skeletal figure of Simon Wiesenthal emerges into the light, not with a cry of joy for his own survival, but with a question burning in his soul: where are they? For the next 60 years, until his death in 2005 at the age of 96, he would dedicate every day to answering that question. He did not seek vengeance, for what vengeance could possibly equal the murder of millions? He sought something far more difficult, far more enduring: accountability. His life's work was a stubborn, unyielding refusal to allow the greatest crime in history to be relegated to the past, to become a mere statistic in a history book. By hunting the men who believed they had gotten away with it, he was not just bringing criminals to justice. He was forcing the world to look, to remember, and to judge. He ensured that the ghosts of the Holocaust would continue to haunt the conscience of the present, forever reminding us that evil is not some abstract force. It is the product of choices made by ordinary men in suits and uniforms. And the fight against that evil and against our own human capacity to forget it never, ever truly ends.